been briefed by several Trump advisors, is this idea of a demilitarised zone in Ukraine. Now, at the moment, Russia occupies about 20% of eastern and southern Ukraine. The implication, I mean, we don't know where that demilitarised zone would be, but the implication is that it would reward in some way the Russians for their invasion a couple of 2.5 years ago, which obviously is unpalatable, I think, to certainly the Biden administration, certainly Ukraine, but also in the much of Europe as well, much of NATO.
Every Thursday, we head to the US to find out what's happening in Washington. And Alistair Dawber is, appropriately enough, the Washington correspondent of the Times and the Sunday Times. Hello, Alistair.
Morning, Hugo.
Quiet week? Much on?
Nah, not much at all. Very quiet. Nothing to do at all.
I'll bet. Donald Trump is, of course, set to re-enter the White House on January the 20th. One of the questions on everybody's mind is who will be behind him. Transition plans are underway and speculation is rising on who will fill his cabinet. What do we know, Alistair, or what do we expect?
Well, there are some big names, obviously, that he has promised jobs to. Now, I'm not sure a promise of a job from Donald Trump is necessarily a guarantee, but we know, for example, that Elon Musk has been mooted as a possible sort of efficiency czar. How can government spend less money? And one of those things that's been mooted is the idea that they scrap the Federal Department of Education. So if that happens, of course, there'll be no education secretary. Another big name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who stood as an independent and then got behind Trump. He is a health advocate, if you like, doesn't believe in things like fluoride in water, is a vaccine skeptic. Trump has suggested that he might get a wide-ranging health brief in the next administration. And then there are sort of the traditional jobs like Treasury Secretary. I think there'll be people who perhaps aren't necessarily familiar with your listeners. It's a guy called Scott Breslin, who's likely, I think, to become the Treasury Secretary. The world, as Trump says, is on fire. So the selection of his Secretary of State is going to be interesting. He's got a long-standing foreign policy advisor called Richard Grenell, who I think is either a candidate for Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. But one thing that's for sure is that over the next sort of couple of months, there's going to be an absolute mad scramble for these jobs. And some of them will be the names will be well known, I think, to listeners in the UK, but some of them less so.
Is the vibe a bit different this time? Because I remember last time around, Trump seemed to have enormous trouble sometimes filling jobs in his administration, and people didn't last long, and it all seemed to have an atmosphere of slight sort of reluctance and farce about it. This time around, is it all a lot more sort of confident?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the sort of the sorts of people who are being suggested for jobs are also different. When, of course, Trump came into office in 2017, he had zero experience of government, and I think relied on people who perhaps had experience of government, but also had vast experience of running big organisations. You'll recall that Rex Tillerson was his first Secretary of State. He was the CEO of ExxonMobil. I think now what Trump is going to really go for are people who are loyal, people who've demonstrated their loyalty, people who aren't going to stand in his way. And we've heard from lots of his ex-administration officials, not least John Kelly's former chief of staff, really criticise his conduct as president during the campaign. I think we'll be getting people that are much more loyal. The chief of staff, for example, is likely, I think, to be Susie Wiles, who's his campaign manager. She's a Florida political operative who's sort of, I think, credited with masterminding much of his campaign.
Let's talk now about what's likely to happen with Ukraine, because Trump has pledged he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, and he's vowed also to stop aid to Kyiv, but he's not specified how he's going to end this war. What do you expect to see, Alistair? Will he straight away put all the US funding to Ukraine? Because that would be massive if he did.
I think there was certainly pressure to do that. I mean, Donald Trump's promise was actually to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of being elected. And I've not had much sleep, but my calculation is that's now more than 24 hours. So, I think, look, we're going to see, I think, under Trump, a much greater reluctance to back Ukraine in the way that the Biden administration's done. We know, for example, that relations between Trump and Vladimir Putin are much warmer. One thing that's been muted overnight, been briefed by several Trump advisors, is this idea of a demilitarised zone in Ukraine. Now, at the moment, Russia occupies about 20% of eastern and southern Ukraine. The implication, I mean, we don't know where that demilitarised zone would be. But the implication is that it would reward in some way the Russians for their invasion a couple of 2.5 years ago. Which obviously is unpalatable, I think, to certainly the Biden administration, certainly Ukraine, but also the much of Europe as well, much of NATO. So we'd see where that lands. I think part of that deal would include NATO not joining, Ukraine not joining NATO for 20 years. But I imagine that the sort of the quid pro quo, if you like, is that the US would keep funding Ukraine to the extent that it could defend itself within its own what would become its new territory.
And how realistically is this being taken in Washington? Because I mean, we all know Trump. He makes a lot of pledges. Some are meant to be serious. Some aren't meant to be serious. Do we think he really is going to consider it a priority to end this war?
I think so. I think one of the reasons he wants to end the war is the amount it's costing the US. Now, in terms of the overall defence budget, what the US spends in Ukraine is actually pretty small. But Trump is all about saving American taxpayer dollars, and clearly money being spent on a foreign war is money that he thinks he can save. I think it is a priority actually to end the war, but obviously there are voices, not least in Ukraine, who say, well, hang on a sec, ending the war is one thing, but if you're going to reward Vladimir Putin for an invasion of a sovereign state, a neighbour, what does that say to other dictators around the world? What does it say to Vladimir Putin in terms of his ambitions for other former Soviet states that he might have his eye on?
And look, finally, Alistair, it does remain unbelievable to many that Trump was able to run and win with criminal conviction to his name. And the question on a lot of people's mind now is, what next? Because with his sentencing being postponed until after the election, what's going to happen? Is there any prospect of a president-elect sentenced to prison? I mean, he's got various legal troubles. What's going to happen to them all?
Well, that's the case. The classified the business documents case, or the business case in New York, where he was found guilty of paying Stormy Daniels, the porn star, hush money. Now he's been convicted in that case. Sentencing is due after the election. There's a story this morning that the judge in that case is considering a non-custodial sentence. I think it being slightly ridiculous to send the president to prison. The two federal cases standing against him, the election interference case in Washington, and the case where he's accused of holding classified documents in Florida after he left office. As the new president, he will just cancel those cases. He would appoint an attorney general who can just dissolve those cases overnight. The fourth and perhaps trickier case is one in Georgia, where that's an election interference case from 2020, specifically in the state of Georgia. The president has no jurisdiction over Georgia state law or any other state law. That said, that case is wound up in lots of appeals. The prosecutor, the district attorney in Fulton County, where the case is being held, is in her own trouble. She's been accused of employing a prosecutor that she was having an affair with, and that's been the basis of lots of Trump's appeals. Quite whether that case ever comes to court, I think remains to be seen, but I think it looks doubtful at this stage.
What a mess. Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, Alistair Dawber. Alistair is, of course, the Washington correspondent of The Times.